The merciless sun hung like a copper coin in the cloudless Arizona sky, its rays turning the desert floor into a shimmering furnace that could kill a man in hours. Jack Donovan pulled the brim of his weathered hat lower, squinting against the glare as his horse, Thunder, picked its way carefully between the scattered sagebrush and jagged rocks. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft thud of hooves on sun-baked earth and the occasional whisper of wind through the desert vegetation. At 32, Jack had spent half his life drifting from town to town across the untamed territories, carrying little more than his Colt 45, a worn leather saddlebag filled with memories he'd rather forget, and a reputation for fairness that preceded him wherever he rode. His face, carved by wind and sun into sharp planes, rarely showed emotion, but his grey eyes missed nothing in this unforgiving landscape he had come to call home. The desert had a way of stripping men down to their essence, revealing who they truly were beneath the masks they wore in civilization. It was the glint of metal that caught his attention first, a flash of something that didn't belong among the muted browns and greys of the desert palette. Thunder's ears pricked forward, the intelligent animal sensing his rider's sudden alertness as Jack guided him toward a cluster of red rocks that jutted from the earth like broken teeth, remnants of some ancient geological violence. There, crumpled, in the meager shade like a discarded doll, lay a young woman. Jack dismounted quickly, his boots crunching on the gravelly ground that radiated heat like the surface of a stove. The woman was barely conscious, her dark skin glistening with sweat that spoke of dehydration and exhaustion, her simple cotton dress torn and stained with dust, blood, and the evidence of days spent running through hostile terrain. Shackles hung loose from one wrist, the heavy iron raw against her skin, where she had obviously fought against them with desperate determination. "Easy now," Jack murmured, his voice gentler than it had been in months, kneeling beside her with the careful movements of a man who understood that trust was a fragile thing. Her eyes fluttered open, deep brown like rich coffee beans, but filled with a wariness that spoke of terrible experiences and betrayals that had taught her to fear the approach of any stranger. She tried to pull away despite her weakness, her body instinctively recoiling from his presence, even as her strength failed her. Every line of her posture screamed of abuse endured and trust shattered beyond easy repair. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked from thirst and raw from the dust she had breathed for days. Don't send me back. I'll die first. I swear I will." Jack's jaw tightened as he took in the shackles, the wounds that spoke of violence, the desperation in her voice that cut through his carefully maintained emotional armor like a blade through silk. He had seen enough of the world's cruelty in his wandering years to understand exactly what he was looking at, and enough injustice to know, without question, what he had to do. "Nobody's sending you anywhere," he said firmly, reaching for his canteen with movements that were deliberately slow and non-threatening. "You're safe now. I give you my word." As she drank greedily from the water he offered, her hands shaking with exhaustion and the desperate need to consume every drop, Jack studied her face with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read people for survival. She couldn't be more than 20, but her eyes held the terrible weight of someone who had lived through horrors he could only imagine, who had seen the worst that humanity could offer, and somehow found the strength to keep fighting. When she finished drinking, she looked up at him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief that nearly broke his heart. It had been so long since anyone had looked at him with anything other than fear or calculation. "My name's Amelia," she said softly, her voice gaining strength with the water she had consumed. "I've been running for 3 days and nights. Maybe more. I lost count." "Jack Donovan," he replied, helping her sit up straighter against the rocks, his hands gentle but strong. "And you don't need to run anymore. Not while I'm here." The sound of distant hoofbeats drifted across the desert like the whisper of approaching death, still far off, but unmistakable to ears trained by years of survival in dangerous territory. Amelia's eyes widened with terror, so pure and consuming that it transformed her entire face, and she grabbed Jack's arm with surprising strength born of desperation. "They're coming!" she gasped, her fingers digging into his sleeve like claws. "The men who own me. They have dogs, guns, ropes. They'll kill you if you help me. They'll make you watch what they do to me first." Jack stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his gun belt, fingers finding the familiar comfort of worn leather and cold metal. In the distance, shimmering through the heat waves like a mirage of vengeance, he could see dust clouds rising, at least 4 riders, maybe more, their horses pushed hard across the unforgiving terrain. His mind raced through the options with the calculating speed of a man who had survived more fights than he cared to remember. They could try to outrun the pursuit, but Amelia was in no condition for a hard ride, and Thunder, strong as he was, couldn't carry double against fresh horses indefinitely. They could make a stand here, but the rocks offered poor cover against multiple attackers. Or, "Can you ride?" he asked, his decision crystallizing with the sudden clarity that comes in moments of mortal danger. Amelia nodded weakly, though whether from actual strength or desperate hope, he couldn't tell. Jack helped her to her feet, noting how she swayed, but refused to fall, her inner strength as impressive as any courage he had witnessed on a dozen battlefields. As he lifted her onto Thunder's back, settling her behind the saddle where she could hold onto him for support, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the fierce protective instinct that comes with caring for another soul, the willingness to risk everything for someone else's freedom. "Hold tight," he murmured, swinging up into the saddle with fluid grace. "We're going to outrun the devil himself if we have to." Thunder lunged forward at Jack's command, his powerful legs eating up the ground as they raced toward the rocky hills. To the north, where Jack knew of hidden trails and secret places that might offer sanctuary. Behind them, the dust clouds grew closer with each passing minute, and the distant baying of tracking dogs carried on the desert wind like the howls of demons. As they rode, Amelia leaned back against Jack's chest, and he could feel her trembling, not just from fear, but from exhaustion and the overwhelming relief of finding someone willing to stand between her and the darkness that pursued her with relentless determination. "Why?" she asked over the thunder of hooves and the rush of wind past their faces. "Why would you risk your life for a stranger? You don't even know me." Jack was quiet for a long moment, his arms steady around her as he guided Thunder through a narrow canyon where the walls rose like cathedral spires on either side, their red stone faces carved by centuries of wind and rain. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "Because some things are worth fighting for," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than any oath sworn on a Bible. "And freedom's one of them." The abandoned mine shaft carved into the canyon wall had been Jack's secret refuge for 2 years, a place he had discovered during a particularly dark period when half the territory seemed to be hunting him for a killing that had been justified but poorly witnessed. Hidden behind a curtain of scrub oak and accessible only by a treacherous goat path that would challenge even the most determined pursuer, it had served him well as a hideout when the law, or men worse than the law, had come looking for him. With ropes and questions he preferred not to answer. Now, as he helped Amelia down from Thunder's back, her legs barely able to support her weight after the punishing ride, the cave felt different. It was no longer just a hiding place for a lone wolf running from his past. It had become a sanctuary for 2 souls finding each other in a world determined to keep them apart. "It's not much," Jack said, his voice echoing slightly in the stone chamber as he lit a small fire near the cave mouth where the smoke would disperse quickly among the rocks. But it's safe. They won't find us here. I've been using this place for years, and nobody's even come close." Amelia sank gratefully onto the bedroll he spread for her, her strength finally giving out completely now that she was no longer running on pure adrenaline and terror. In the flickering firelight that danced across the rough stone walls, Jack could see the full extent of her injuries: rope burns on her wrists where the shackles had chafed, cuts on her feet from running barefoot across rough ground that would tear flesh from bone, and bruises that spoke of harder treatment than any human being should be forced to endure. "Let me tend to those wounds," he said gently, pulling medical supplies from his saddlebags with the practiced efficiency of a man who had patched up more than his share of injuries in remote places. "You've got some nasty cuts here that need cleaning before they fester." As he cleaned and bandaged her injuries with gentle hands that had dealt death but could also heal, Amelia told him her story in halting whispers that painted a picture of hell on earth. Born into slavery on a plantation in Georgia during the dying days of the peculiar institution, she had been sold to a cruel man named Thaddeus Blackwood when she was 16, taken west to his ranch in New Mexico Territory, where the law was thin and a man's property rights were rarely questioned. For 4 years, she had endured treatment that would have broken most people: back-breaking labor in the scorching heat, inadequate food and shelter, and worse things that she couldn't bring herself to speak about even now. But the human spirit, Jack reflected as he listened to her quiet words, was a remarkably resilient thing. Where others might have surrendered to despair, Amelia had nurtured a flame of defiance that had finally erupted into desperate action. "I've been running for 3 weeks, she said, wincing as Jack applied salve to a particularly deep cut on her ankle. "Sleeping in trees when I could find them, eating berries and roots, drinking from streams when I could find clean water. I thought I was going to die in that desert. I was ready to die rather than go back." "You're stronger than you know," Jack said, his voice gentle but firm. "Not many could have made it as far as you did. Hell, not many would have tried." When he finished tending her wounds, wrapping them carefully in clean cloth torn from his spare shirt, Jack prepared a simple meal of beans and hardtack, supplemented with rabbit he had caught that morning and dried meat from his provisions. As they ate, sharing the warmth of the small fire and the comfort of human companionship, Amelia studied his face in the dancing light. "You're not like other white men I've known," she said quietly, her observation carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. Jack poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing up toward the cave ceiling like tiny stars, avoiding her penetrating gaze. "My mother was half Cherokee," he said finally, the words coming slowly as if each one cost him something. "Lost her when I was 12. My father, well, he was a hard man who got harder after she died. I learned early what it means to be different, to be treated as less than human because of blood that flows in your veins. Maybe that's why I can't stomach seeing it done to others." As the night deepened and the desert beyond their sanctuary came alive with the sounds of nocturnal hunters, the call of coyotes echoing off canyon walls, the whisper of wings as owls swept through the darkness, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, Jack kept watch at the cave mouth while Amelia slept fitfully on the bedroll. But it was the sound he didn't hear that worried him most. No pursuit, no dogs baying on their trail, no voices calling out threats or promises of reward. Blackwood's men had lost the trail, at least for now, but Jack knew they wouldn't give up. Men like Blackwood didn't accept losing their property without a fight, and they had the law on their side. Territorial or federal, it made little difference when it came to the return of runaway slaves. As dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, filtering through the cave mouth like liquid metal, Amelia stirred, opening her eyes to find Jack silhouetted against the growing light, his rifle across his knees and his attention fixed on the world beyond their temporary refuge. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, concerned by the shadows under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. "I've gone longer without sleep," he replied with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Besides, someone had to keep an eye out for unwanted visitors. These canyons have a way of carrying sound, and I wanted to make sure we stayed alone." Amelia sat up, stretching muscles still sore from her ordeal, wincing as various injuries made themselves known. "What happens now? We can't hide here forever. They'll keep looking, and eventually—" Jack had been asking himself the same question all night, weighing options and calculating odds with the methodical approach that had kept him alive through numerous dangerous situations. "There's a town called Silver Creek about 2 days' ride north," he said. "It's not big, maybe 100 people on a good day, but it's got a sheriff who's actually honest. Name's Tom Bradley. He might be willing to help." "Help a runaway slave?" Amelia's voice was bitter, laced with the cynicism that comes from too many disappointments. "The Fugitive Slave Act says anyone who helps me is breaking federal law. Why? Would he risk his career, maybe his life, for someone like me?" "Is a piece of paper," Jack interrupted firmly, his grey eyes flashing with conviction. "And Bradley's the kind of man who believes the law should serve justice, not the other way. Around. I've known him for 5 years, and I've never seen him back down from what's right just because it's dangerous." As they prepared to leave the cave, packing what supplies they could carry without overloading thunder for the journey ahead, Amelia caught Jack's hand in hers, her fingers warm and surprisingly strong. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, her dark eyes searching his face for the truth that lay beneath his carefully controlled exterior. "Really? What's this about for you?" Jack looked down at their joined hands, her dark skin against his sun-weathered tan, the contrast that the world saw as a barrier, but that he was beginning to see as something beautiful, a symbol of two different worlds coming together against all odds. "Maybe I'm tired of running from everything," he said quietly, his voice carrying a vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to see. "Maybe it's time to run towards something instead. Maybe I've been alone so long that I'd forgotten what it feels like to have someone worth protecting." The words hung between them, like a bridge over dangerous waters, an admission of feelings neither of them had expected, but both recognized as something precious and fragile in a world that seemed determined to destroy anything beautiful it encountered. Silver Creek lived up to its name, a ribbon of clear water cutting through the heart of a town that had grown up around silver mining claims staked out by optimistic prospectors in the early days of territorial expansion. The main street was lined with the usual frontier establishments, a saloon with batwing doors and the sound of piano music drifting out into the afternoon air, a general store with false front and hand-painted signs advertising everything from ammunition to ladies' corsets, a church with a bell tower that could be seen for miles across the desert, and a dozen other businesses that served the needs of miners, ranchers, and the occasional drifter looking for a fresh start. Jack and Amelia approached carefully in the late afternoon, riding double on thunder, as the sun slanted low across the weathered buildings and cast long shadows between the structures. Jack had fashioned a simple but hopefully effective disguise for Amelia. Men's clothes he had bought from a Mexican trader months earlier, boots that were too big but would pass casual inspection, and a hat pulled low to hide her distinctive features and the intelligent eyes that marked her as something more than the average frontier woman. But he knew it wouldn't fool anyone who looked too closely or too long, and there were always those in any town who made it their business to study strangers and ask uncomfortable questions about their origins and intentions. Sheriff Tom Bradley was exactly as Jack remembered him, a tall, lean man with graying hair and weathered hands, ashes that had seen enough of life's cruelties to be kind without being naive, and a reputation for fairness that had earned him respect from both sides of most disputes. When Jack walked into his office, spurs jingling softly on the plank floor, Bradley's weathered face broke into a genuine smile of welcome. "Jack Donovan," he said, rising from behind his desk with its scattered papers and half-empty coffee cup. "Heard you were dead, shot down in Tucson, according to the stories making the rounds." "Not yet," Jack replied with a grin that felt rusty from disuse. "Though there's some who wish otherwise, and probably more who'll be disappointed to hear. I'm still breathing." Bradley's expression grew serious as he took in Jack's dusty appearance, the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes kept flicking toward the window where Amelia waited with the horses, her face shadowed by the hat brim, but her posture alert for any sign of trouble. "What brings you to Silver Creek? And don't tell me it's just a social call, because I can see trouble written all over you, like ink on paper." Jack glanced toward the window again, where he could see Amelia waiting with the horses, her hands steady on the reins, but her entire body coiled with the readiness to run that had kept her alive for weeks of desperate flight. "I need your help, Tom, and I need to know I can trust you completely with something that could get us both killed if it goes wrong." "You know you can," Bradley said simply, his voice carrying the weight of years of friendship and mutual respect. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." Jack told him everything. Finding Amelia collapsed in the desert like a broken bird, her story of escape from bondage and brutality, the pursuit they had evaded through luck and skill and sheer determination. When he finished, Bradley was quiet, for a long moment, drumming his fingers on the desk as he considered the implications of what he had just heard. "You know what you're asking," the sheriff said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility. "Harboring a fugitive slave is a federal crime under the Fugitive Slave Act. I could lose my badge, face prison time, maybe even a rope if the wrong people get involved. And it wouldn't just be me, my wife, my children, they'd suffer for my choices too." "I know," Jack said, his voice steady despite the fear he felt for both their futures. "But I also know you, Tom. I know what kind of man you are, and I know you won't turn your back on someone who needs help just because helping them is dangerous." Bradley studied Jack's face, seeing something there he had never seen before in all their years of friendship, a man in love, willing to risk everything for that love, transformed from a lone wolf into someone who had found something worth dying for. "There might be a way," Bradley said slowly, his lawman's mind already working through the possibilities and pitfalls. "If she's willing to work for it, and if we can make it look legal enough to satisfy any federal marshals who might come sniffing around." An hour later, Amelia sat across from the sheriff in his office, her hands folded tightly in her lap, but her back straight with pride that no amount of suffering had been able to break. Jack stood behind her chair, his presence a steady comfort, and his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "The territorial government has been looking for teachers," Bradley explained, pulling documents from his desk drawer. "Someone to work with the Indian children at the mission school, and maybe some of the Mexican kids whose families work the mines. It's dangerous work. There's still Apache raiding parties that come through now and then, and not everyone in town is going to be happy about having a colored woman teaching their children. But it would give you legal employment, a reason to be here that might satisfy federal authorities." "I can read and write," Amelia said quietly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "My master's daughter taught me when I was young, though. She wasn't supposed to. I can do numbers too, and I know some Spanish from the Mexican workers on the ranch." "That's more education than most folks have around here," Bradley replied, his respect for her evident in his tone. "The job comes with a cabin behind the mission, basic supplies, and protection under territorial law. It's not perfect, and there's no guarantee it'll keep the federal marshals away forever. But it's a start." As they finalized the arrangements, Jack felt hope stirring in his chest for the first time in years. Not just the hope of survival, but the hope of actually building a life with someone who understood both his strengths and his demons. Maybe they could build something real here, away from the hatred and violence that had defined their separate pasts. But as they left the sheriff's office and walked down the main street toward the mission, Jack noticed the way curtains twitched in windows, the way conversations stopped when they passed, the calculating looks that followed their progress through town. Small towns had their own ways of communicating, their own networks of gossip and speculation, and news traveled faster than wildfire through dry grass. By evening, when they were settled in the small but comfortable cabin behind the mission with its whitewashed walls and simple furnishings, Jack knew their peace wouldn't last long. The knock on the door came just as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Father Miguel, the elderly priest, who ran the mission with gentle hands and an iron will, stood on their doorstep with worry etched deep in the lines of his face. Born in Mexico but educated in Spain, he had seen enough of the world's injustices to recognize them when they appeared on his doorstep. "There are men in town," he said quietly in accented English, his voice carrying the weight of bad news. "Men, asking questions about a runaway slave and the man who helped her. They have papers, federal warrants, and they're offering gold for information." Jack's hand moved instinctively to his gun, fingers finding the familiar comfort of worn leather and cold steel. How many? 5, maybe 6. They're staying at the hotel, but they've been talking to people all afternoon, showing pictures, making threats. The man who leads them. Father Miguel crossed himself. There is something evil about him, something that makes decent people cross the street to avoid his shadow. Amelia appeared at Jack's shoulder, her face pale, but her jaw set with determination. That reminded him of forged steel. "It's Blackwood," she said with absolute certainty. "I know it is. He'll never stop hunting me. He'd rather see me dead than free." "Then we need to be ready," Jack said grimly, already checking his weapons and calculating angles of fire from the cabin's windows. "Because men like that don't give up easy, and they sure as hell don't fight fair." As Father Miguel melted back into the darkness like a ghost seeking sanctuary, Jack checked his weapons, while Amelia packed their few belongings with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to travel light and move fast. They both knew their time in Silver Creek was running out like sand through an hourglass, but neither was willing to give up without a fight. "Whatever happens," Jack said, taking her hands in his and looking into her eyes with an intensity that conveyed everything words couldn't express, "I want you to know, these past few days with you have been the best of my life. You've shown me what it means to have something worth fighting for." Amelia smiled through tears she refused to shed, her strength shining like a beacon in the growing darkness. "Mine too," she whispered, her voice carrying all the love and hope and determination that had brought them this far. "Mine too." Outside, the desert wind carried the sound of horses and men's voices, getting closer with each passing hour, like the approach of a storm that would test everything they had built together. The confrontation came at dawn, when the desert air was still cool and carried the scent of sagebrush and possibility, when the town of Silver Creek lay quiet under a blanket of morning mist that would soon burn away under the relentless sun. Jack had been awake for hours, positioned at the cabin window with his rifle across his knees, watching as Blackwood's men took positions around the mission with the methodical precision of experienced killers. They were professionals. He could see that in every movement, disciplined, well-armed, and utterly ruthless in a way that spoke of men who had done this kind of work before and enjoyed it. They moved like wolves, circling wounded prey, patient and confident in their eventual victory. Thaddeus Blackwood himself stood in the middle of the dusty street like a figure from a nightmare, a tall man in an expensive black coat that seemed to absorb the early light and reflect nothing back but darkness. His face was sharp-featured and cruel, with pale eyes that held no warmth or mercy, and thin lips that curved in a smile that promised suffering to anyone who opposed him. In his hand, he held a set of legal documents that gave him the right, according to federal law, to reclaim his property and punish anyone who had dared to interfere with his rights as a slaveholder. "Jack Donovan!" Blackwood's voice carried clearly in the still air, each word precisely enunciated with the accent of educated evil. "I know you're in there with my property. Send out the girl, and maybe I'll let you ride away with your life and all your important parts still attached." Jack stepped onto the cabin's small porch, his hand resting on his gun butt with the casual confidence of a man who had survived more fights than he could count. Behind him, Amelia pressed close to the doorway, her eyes bright with a mixture of terror and defiance that spoke of a woman who would rather die than return to slavery. "She's not going anywhere," Jack called back, his voice carrying across the morning stillness with absolute conviction. "She's a free woman now, with papers to prove it, and the law to back her up." Blackwood's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass, sharp and cutting and devoid of any human warmth. "Papers from a territorial sheriff. Those aren't worth the ink they're written with when it comes to federal law. That girl belongs to me, body and soul, and I'm taking her back to face punishment for running away." "Over my dead body," Jack said, quietly, but his words carried clearly in the morning stillness, a promise that rang like steel on steel. "That can be arranged quite easily," Blackwood replied with obvious pleasure, signaling to his men with a gesture that spoke of long practice in violence. The first shot came from the roof of the general store, the bullets splintering the wood near Jack's head and sending splinters flying like tiny daggers. He dove back into the cabin as gunfire erupted from all directions, bullets punching through the thin walls and shattering the windows in explosions of glass and lead. "Stay down!" Jack shouted to Amelia, returning fire through the broken window, with the steady precision of a man who had learned to shoot when his life depended on accuracy. His first shot took down the man on the roof, sending him tumbling into the street with a crash that scattered the horses tied at the hitching posts and sent them racing out of town in panic. The battle was fierce but brief, a violent storm of gunfire and shouting that shattered the morning peace like a hammer blow. Jack was outnumbered, but he had the advantage of cover and the desperate motivation of a man fighting for love. His bullets found their marks with deadly precision, dropping 2 more of Blackwood's men before the others began to retreat, their confidence shaken by the realization that their easy capture had turned into a bloody war. But as the gun smoke cleared and silence returned to the street like a guilty secret, Jack saw Sheriff Bradley lying motionless in the dust, cut down, while trying to reach the cabin to help defend it. The sight filled him with cold rage that burned like ice in his veins, and he stepped out onto the porch, despite Amelia's cries for him to stay back and stay safe. "Enough!" he roared, his voice echoing off the buildings and carrying across the desert like the call of a hunting hawk. "This ends now, Blackwood." The slave owner stood alone in the street now, his surviving men having fled when they realized their easy payday had turned into a fight for their lives. But Blackwood wasn't finished. His pride and his twisted sense of ownership wouldn't let him retreat without claiming his prize. He drew his own gun, a pearl-handled Colt that gleamed in the morning sun like a piece of jewelry designed for killing. "You've cost me good men, Donovan," he snarled, his cultured voice cracking with rage and frustration. "But I'm still walking away with what belongs to me, and you're going to watch me break her before I put a bullet in your brain." The 2 men faced each other across 30 feet of dusty ground, the classic confrontation of the frontier where disputes were settled with lead and the fastest draw decided who lived to see another sunset. Jack's hand hovered over his gun, every muscle tensed for the draw he knew was coming, his mind clear and focused on the deadly mathematics of survival. But it was Amelia who broke the deadly silence, stepping out onto the porch beside Jack with a courage that took his breath away. I belong to no one, she said, her voice carrying across the street with absolute conviction. In her hands, she held an old shotgun Father Miguel had given her, and her finger was steady on the trigger despite everything she had endured. "And I'll die before I go back to being your slave." Blackwood's eyes flicked between them, calculating odds and measuring distances with the cold precision of a predator. "You think you can build a life together?" He sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "The world will never accept it. They'll hunt you down like animals, and when they catch you, they'll make you wish you'd never been born." "Maybe," Jack said, his voice calm despite the fury burning in his chest like a forge fire. "But at least we'll be free, and that's more." "Then you'll ever understand." Blackwood's hand moved toward his gun in a blur of motion, but Jack was faster. Years of practice and the motivation of love gave speed to his draw, and the Colt .45 cleared leather in a smooth, practiced motion that seemed to slow time itself. The shot echoed across the desert like thunder, and Blackwood staggered backward, looking down in surprise at the spreading red stain on his expensive coat. "Impossible," he whispered, then collapsed into the dust that had claimed so many other men's dreams and schemes. In the silence that followed, broken only by the distant sound of horses as the surviving gunmen fled town, Jack holstered his gun and turned to Amelia. She was shaking, the shotgun trembling in her hands, but her eyes were bright with the realization that their nightmare was finally over. "It's done," Jack said softly, taking her in his arms and feeling her heart beating against his chest like a caged bird finally finding freedom. "We're free." 6 months later, Jack and Amelia stood on a hill overlooking the valley where they had built their new life from the ashes of their violent past. The cabin was small but sturdy, built with Jack's own hands from timber cut in the mountains and adobe bricks made from the rich soil of the valley floor. It had a vegetable garden that Amelia tended with loving care, coaxing tomatoes and corn and beans from earth that had never known such gentle cultivation, and a corral where Jack trained horses for the growing settlements throughout the territory. The mission school where Amelia taught had become the heart of a small but thriving community that seemed to grow a little larger each month as word spread of a place where people were judged by their character rather than the color of their skin. Children of all backgrounds came to learn from the gentle woman who had fought so hard for her own education. Apache children whose families had made peace with the territorial government, Mexican children whose parents worked the silver mines, and even a few white children whose parents recognized quality teaching when they saw it. She was patient with the slow learners, encouraging with the quick ones, and loved by all of them with the fierce devotion that children reserve for adults who truly understand them. Under her guidance, the school had grown from a single room to a complex of buildings that included a library, a workshop where older children learned practical skills, and living quarters for students whose families lived too far away to make daily travel practical. Jack had found work as a deputy territorial marshal, his reputation for fairness and skill with a gun making him valuable to the territorial government as they worked to bring law and order to the wild frontier. The badge on his chest was a symbol of the law he had once run from, but now he wore it proudly, knowing he could make a real difference in the lives of people who needed protection from the predators that thrived in lawless places. His territory covered 3 counties, and he spent much of his time on horseback, mediating disputes between ranchers and farmers, tracking down criminals who thought the vast distances would protect them from justice, and generally serving as the long arm of civilization in places where civilization was still a fragile and precious thing. Their love had not gone unnoticed or unchallenged by everyone in the territory. There were still those who whispered behind their backs when they walked down the street together, who crossed to the other side to avoid them, who made it clear that a white man and a black woman together offended their sense of proper order and natural law. But there were others, Good people like Father Miguel, like the memory of Sheriff Bradley, whose sacrifice had made their freedom possible, like the children Amelia taught and the families Jack protected, who saw past the artificial barriers of color to the strength of character beneath. The territorial governor himself had visited their school the previous month, bringing with him a delegation of officials and potential investors who were impressed by what they saw. Education, he declared in a speech that was reported in newspapers as far away as Denver and San Francisco, was the key to bringing civilization to the frontier, and teachers like Amelia were doing the work of nation-building. On this particular evening, as the sun set over the desert, they had crossed together in those desperate first days, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold that seemed to set the very air on fire. Jack pulled Amelia close and felt the deep peace that came with knowing they had found their place in an often hostile world. The sound of children's laughter drifted up from the mission below, where some of Amelia's older students were playing. A game of their own invention that seemed to involve equal parts of running, shouting, and pure joy. It was a sound that never failed to bring a smile to both their faces, a reminder of the future they were helping to build, one young mind at a time. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet. The life you gave up to help a stranger in the desert, the simple existence you had before I complicated everything. Jack was quiet for a moment, thinking of all the roads they had traveled together, all the dangers they had faced side by side, all the love they had discovered in the midst of hatred and violence. He thought of the man he had been before that blazing day when he found her collapsed among the rocks, a drifter with no real purpose, no connections, no reason to believe in anything beyond his own survival. "The only thing I regret," he said finally, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of a man who had found his truth, "is that it took me so long to find you, that we wasted all those years living separate lives when we could have been building something together." As if summoned by their conversation, a rider appeared on the trail that led up from the valley, his horse moving at an easy lope that suggested news rather than emergency. As he drew closer, they recognized Miguel Santos, one of the Mexican miners who had become a regular visitor to their home and a strong supporter of the school. "Senor Jack, Senora Amelia," he called as he dismounted near their porch, his weathered face creased with excitement. "I bring news from the territorial capital. Great news." He pulled a folded letter from his shirt pocket, the paper bearing official seals that marked it as government correspondence. "The territorial legislature," he said, barely able to contain his enthusiasm. "They have voted to establish a teachers' college here in Silver Creek, with Senora Amelia as the first director. They want to train more teachers like her to spread education throughout the territory." Amelia took the letter with hands that trembled slightly, scanning the official language that confirmed what Miguel had said. The territory would provide funding for buildings, supplies, and salaries for a staff of instructors. Students would come from all over the Southwest to learn the latest methods of education, and graduates would carry those methods to schools throughout the region. "There's more," Miguel continued, his grin growing even wider. "They're also offering Senor Jack the position of territorial marshal for the entire northern district. It comes with a big house in town, a good salary, and the authority to build the kind of law enforcement the territory needs." Jack and Amelia looked at each other, seeing in each other's eyes the recognition that their lives were about to change again, not through violence or fear this time, but through opportunity and respect earned through years of hard work and dedication. "What do you think?" Jack asked quietly. "Are you ready to take on the challenge of molding the next generation of teachers?" Amelia smiled, the expression transforming her face and reminding him of the courage she had shown that first. day when she declared that she would rather die than return to slavery. "I think," she said slowly, "that this is what we were meant to do. This is why we survived everything we went through, to make sure other people don't have to suffer the way we did." 2 years later, the Silver Creek Teachers College had become the pride of the territory, attracting students and attention from as far away as California and Texas. The campus now included 5 substantial buildings arranged around a central courtyard, where students gathered to study and debate under the shade of cottonwood trees that Amelia had planted during the college's first year. The student body was as diverse as the frontier itself. Young women from ranching families who wanted to bring education to isolated communities. Mexican-American students who understood the importance of bilingual instruction, former soldiers who had found a new mission in teaching, and even a few Native American students whose tribal leaders recognized education as essential for survival. In the changing West, Amelia had proven herself to be not just a gifted teacher, but a natural administrator who could balance competing interests and personalities while never losing sight of the college's mission. She had developed innovative teaching methods that combined traditional academic subjects with practical skills needed for frontier life, and her graduates were in high demand throughout the territory. Jack's work as territorial marshal had expanded as well, and he now supervised a network of deputies and local sheriffs across a region the size of some eastern states. The job required him to travel extensively, but he had built a reputation for fairness and effectiveness that made his badge respected even in the most lawless corners of the territory. The couple had also become unofficial leaders in the growing movement for territorial statehood, hosting meetings in their home, where politicians, business leaders, and educators gathered to plan for the day when their territory would become a full-fledged state with representation in Congress. But success had brought new challenges and new enemies. There were those who resented the influence of a former slave and a half-breed marshal, who spread whispers about the unnatural relationship between a black woman and a white man, who suggested that the territory's moral character was being corrupted by their example. The crisis came on a hot July day when Jack was in the territorial capital on business, and Amelia was conducting summer classes at the college. A group of men, calling themselves the Committee for Territorial Purity, rode into Silver Creek with masks covering their faces and hatred in their hearts. They had planned their attack carefully, timing it for when Jack was away and when most of the town's men were at work in the mines or on distant ranches. Their target was not just Amelia and the college, but everything the couple represented, the possibility that the frontier could be different from the places they had left behind, that America could be more than just another country, where might made right and color determined destiny. The attack began at sunset, with riders surrounding the college and shouting threats and obscenities that shattered the peaceful evening air. They demanded that the Negro teacher come out and face justice for corrupting the youth of the territory, for promoting ideas that went against the natural order of things. But Amelia was not the frightened young woman who had collapsed in the desert 5 years earlier. She was now a leader, an educator, and a symbol of hope for people throughout the territory. When the masked riders called for her to surrender herself, she stepped onto the college's front porch with her head held high and her voice steady with conviction. "I am Amelia Donovan," she announced, her words carrying clearly in the still air. "I am a teacher, a citizen of this territory, and a free woman who owes no man an explanation for her existence or her work." The leader of the group, a man whose voice carried the educated accent of someone who should have known better, laughed harshly. "You're an uppity Negro who needs to learn her place," he snarled, "and we're here to teach you." But as the masked riders prepared to advance on the college, they found their way blocked by an unexpected obstacle. Students, faculty, and townspeople, had gathered in response to the shouting, and they formed a protective circle around the building where Amelia stood. There were Mexican miners with their families, Apache students who had learned to see education as a weapon more powerful than any rifle, white ranchers whose children attended the college, and even some of the town's business leaders who recognized that the college brought prosperity and respectability to Silver Creek. "You want to get to her," called out Father Miguel, now elderly but still strong in spirit. "You'll have to go, through all of us." The standoff might have ended in bloodshed, but at that moment the sound of galloping hooves announced the arrival of Jack and a posse of territorial marshals who had ridden hard from the capital when word of the threat reached them. Jack's face was grim as he surveyed the scene, taking in the masked riders, the protective crowd, and his wife standing proud and unafraid on the college porch. "You men have exactly 1 minute to remove those masks and explain what you're doing. Here," he announced, his voice carrying the full authority of his badge and his reputation. "After that, I start making arrests for disturbing the peace and threatening a territorial official." The confrontation ended not with gunfire, but with the quiet disbanding of cowards who discovered that their courage disappeared when faced with real opposition. The masked riders melted away into the darkness, leaving behind only dust and the bitter taste of hatred confronted by community solidarity. As autumn painted the cottonwoods in shades of gold and red, Jack and Amelia stood once again on their favorite hill overlooking the valley that had become their world. But now they were not alone. Their adopted daughter Maria, a Mexican orphan who had become one of Amelia's most promising students, played at their feet while their infant son slept peacefully in Amelia's arms. The child had been born 6 months. Earlier, a symbol of hope and continuity that had brought joy not just to his parents, but to the entire community. His mixed heritage, part Cherokee, part African, part European, made him a living embodiment of the new America that was being born in places like Silver Creek, where people were judged by their character rather than their bloodline. "He's going to grow up in a different world than we did," Amelia said softly, adjusting the blanket around the baby's dark hair. "A world where his parents' love story isn't seen as a crime or an abomination." Jack nodded, though he knew the fight for equality and justice would continue long after they were gone. "Maybe," he said, "but even if he faces some of the same struggles we did, he'll face them with something we never had growing up, the knowledge that love can overcome anything and that there are people willing to stand up for what's right." The Territorial Statehood Convention was scheduled to meet in Silver Creek the following spring, with delegates from across the region gathering to draft a constitution for the proposed state. Jack had been elected as a delegate, and Amelia had been asked to chair the Education Committee, recognition of how far they had come from the desperate fugitives who had found each other in the desert. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, they reflected on the long journey that had brought them to this moment of peace and purpose. The scars were still there, physical reminders of the violence they had endured, emotional memories of the hatred they had faced, but they had been transformed by love and service into sources of strength rather than pain. "Do you think they'll write our story someday?" Amelia asked with a smile. "The runaway slave and the wandering gunfighter who found each other and helped build a new kind of community." Jack chuckled, shifting their son to a more comfortable position. "Maybe they will," he said, "but I hope they get it right. I hope they understand that it wasn't about us being heroes or doing anything extraordinary. It was just about 2 people who decided that love was worth fighting for." As they walked back down the hill toward their home, where lamplight glowed warmly in the windows and the sound of Maria's laughter drifted out into the desert night, they carried with them the satisfaction of lives well lived and love well fought for. Behind them, the desert stretched endlessly under the starlight, holding the secrets of all the other love stories that had played out in its vastness, some ending in tragedy, others in triumph, all of them part of the great human drama of hope and heartbreak that had always defined the American frontier. But their story was one of the triumphs, a testament to the power of two hearts that had dared to beat as one in a world determined to keep them apart. And in the growing community of Silver Creek, in the lives they had touched and the students they had taught and the future they had helped to build, their legacy would live on long after the last of their generation had returned to the dust from which they came. The desert wind sang through the sagebrush, carrying their story across the endless miles, a song of courage and commitment, of justice fought for and won, of love that had not only survived, but had flourished in the face of every obstacle the world could place in its path. In the end, Jack, Donovan, and Amelia had discovered what the Old West truly offered to those brave enough to claim it, not just land or gold or adventure, but the chance to write their own story, to love without limits, and to be truly, completely, magnificently free. Epilogue. 50 years later. The old woman sat in her rocking chair on the porch of the Silver Creek Teachers College, now one of the most respected educational institutions in the state. Her hair was white as desert sand, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes still held the fire that had carried her through a lifetime of struggles and triumphs. Students passing by would tip their hats respectfully to Professor Emeritus Amelia Donovan, some knowing her story, others simply recognizing the dignity that surrounded her like an invisible cloak. At 90, she was one of the last survivors of the territorial period, a living link to the days when the West was still wild and anything seemed possible for those brave enough to reach for it. Her husband had died 10 years earlier, passing peacefully in his sleep after a life that had taken him from wandering gunfighter to respected lawman to elder statesman of their community. His funeral had been attended by governors and senators, by Apache chiefs and Mexican business leaders, by hundreds of former students and countless people whose lives had been touched by his commitment to justice. But it was the simple inscription on his gravestone that told the real story. Jack Donovan, beloved husband, father, and friend, he found his purpose in love. Now, as the desert sunset painted the sky in the familiar shades of orange and gold that had witnessed their first meeting so many decades before, Amelia smiled at the sight of her great-grandchildren playing in the courtyard where she had once taught the first generation of frontier educators. Their skin showed the beautiful mixture of races that was becoming increasingly common in the new America. Some lighter, some darker, all of them free to be whatever their talents and determination could make them. In their faces, she could see the future her husband had dreamed of, the world they had fought to create with every breath they drew and every stand they took. A young journalist from the Territorial Historical Society had visited that morning, asking her to record her memories for posterity. She had agreed, knowing that stories like hers needed to be preserved, but she had insisted on ending with the same words she had spoken to Jack all those years ago, when he asked why she had risked everything for love. Because some things are worth fighting for, she had said, her voice still strong despite her age. And love, real love, the kind that sees past all the artificial barriers people put up to divide us, that's the most important battle any of us will ever fight. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky above Silver Creek, Amelia Donovan closed her eyes and let herself remember the young man who had found her dying in the desert and had chosen to risk everything to save her. In her heart, she could still feel the thunder of hooves beneath them as they rode toward freedom, still hear his voice promising that she would never have to run again. They had kept that promise to each other, and in keeping it, they had helped keep alive the dream that America could be more than just another country, that it could be a place where love conquered hate, where justice prevailed over prejudice, and where two hearts could beat as one, regardless of what the world said was possible. Their love story had become legend, but it was also something more practical and enduring. It was proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they had something worth fighting for, and the courage to see the fight through to the end.